Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar on building agricultural resilience in a changing landscape. We're thrilled to have our expert speaker, Dr. Craig Allen, who is a leading resilience scientist. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself and go over a few housekeeping notes. My name is Laura Coates, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Our mission is to protect Nebraska's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement. We do this through locally led education efforts and community projects that address conservation concerns across the state. Now we have a few quick housekeeping items. If you're joining us online, your cameras are off and microphones are muted throughout the presentation. Please feel free to type any questions you have in the chat or Q&A section. We'll address them during or after the presentation. After the webinar, we'll share a brief survey that takes less than a minute to complete. Your feedback helps us continue offering programs like this, so we appreciate your feedback in the survey. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube at a later date in case you'd like to revisit it or share it with others. If you're interested in connecting with the Conservation Nebraska team member or learning more about our work, you can reach us at info@anyconserve.org. I'll type that email in the chat as well. We are excited to welcome Dr. Craig Allen. And Craig, I will let you introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you, Laura. I assume everybody can hear me or type it in the chat otherwise. But yes, I'm Craig Allen. I'm a professor at the University of Nebraska, research professor right now. Until recently, I was the director of the Center for Resilience in Working Agricultural Landscapes, but now partly or largely retired, as perhaps you can tell from my background. I'm not in Nebraska at the moment. I'm on a island in northern Lake Michigan where I've moved to. Thankfully, I think we have fiber, so I can still communicate from up here. I have indeed spent my entire professional career working on questions of resilience. And so today I'd like to talk about resilience and specifically resilience of landscapes and agricultural landscapes. And hopefully after my presentation, folks will uh, really better know the concept of resilience and some of the threats to the Nebraska landscapes. But more especially that idea of what resilience really means scientifically, because everybody has an intuitive idea of what resilience is, but there's a lot more depth to the concept scientifically. So I'm not going to go deep, but hopefully I can get these concepts across pretty simply. So I have a slide show, so I will share my screen and jump into my slides, which I'll try to move along quite quickly. Let me get the sharing up and going. And hopefully folks can see the screen. Put it in the chat if you can't. So keep in mind, I'm unable to see folks, so I will assume all is well. So I'm going to talk specifically about resilience in working agricultural landscapes. And the reality is in Nebraska and the Great Plains and actually much of the US, all our landscapes are working. They're doing something, producing food or fiber or something similar. And I want to talk about resilience, what it is, and why the concept really matters in a deep way. It's a theory of change in complex systems of people and nature. And we think about agricultural systems really are entwined systems of people and nature. They don't exist without deep human intervention, and they feed back the natural aspects of the landscapes back to humans in the production of food, but in other aspects, the output of ecosystem services from agricultural land, etc. As I'm sure you are all familiar, especially in Nebraska, agriculture has a huge range from native sandhills rangeland with relatively little human input and with cows sort of replacing our native herbivores, bison in this case, to systems at the other extreme, which are highly modified and take constant and intensive and extensive inputs in terms of fertilizer, pesticides, working the soil, etc., constantly on an annual basis and more over time. So just to set the stage, agriculture, period, and agriculture in Nebraska or anywhere else does not exist in a vacuum. We all exist as part of this planet. The planet's undergoing rapid change. So this is just a few items that are somewhat random. We won't go through the long list, but the Earth is rapidly changing, the most rapid change and anthropogenic change as has ever happened to the world. And some examples are in the last 30 years, more cropland has been converted than the 150 years prior to that. If we look outside of cropland, the world's coral reefs are in danger. 20% of coral reefs have been lost and 20% are degraded. And actually, bleaching events in the last several years have affected most of corals worldwide. And part of that effect is from agricultural runoff onto reefs. Mangroves have been lost globally, and mangroves have important services for humanity. Withdrawals from lakes and rivers have doubled. And Nebraska is really blessed with the Great Plains aquifer. But if you live farther south on the aquifer in Texas or Oklahoma, you're in a bit of trouble right now if you're a farmer relying on irrigation, excuse me. It's been stated or estimated that agricultural production must increase by more than 70%, nearly doubling by 2050, such as 25 years from now, to meet the global demand for food, fuel, and fiber. That's a big ask. And therefore, sustainable intensification of agriculture is a grand challenge for humanity that's going to require fostering resilient working landscapes and transforming, and I'll talk about what transformation really means, transforming landscapes that are currently in undesirable states. So as I've stated, planet Earth is rapidly changing. I just gave a random example of some of those more negative changes, just as examples. But those changes all do interact. Their interactions are very complex, changing climate with changing land use change, with changes to our hydrology, all interact in sort of unexpected ways. And one of the ways and reasons why those responses are unexpected is they're often nonlinear and occur as a threshold response. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So there's a framework that's needed to understand this kind of sudden, surprising, nonlinear change. And that framework, or at least I would contend it is resilience. So how would my resilience concepts help us manage working landscapes, or all landscapes, really? So again, to repeat just a bit here, the human population is increasing. It's continuing to increase. It looks like it may asymptote by about 2050, but with about 4 billion more people on the planet. And our productivity is lagging. It's not keeping up with that increase in population. So again, grand challenge for humanity. And that grand challenge is occurring at a time when global systems are really stressed. There's a concept which I really won't get into the depth on called planetary boundaries. This idea that there are limits to human, or not human, just changes to the planet that can be um, taken by the globe without exceeding a critical threshold and having very negative impacts. And some of those boundaries include ocean pH, so the amount of acidification in the planet, nutrients in the planet, climate change, and several other aspects. Point, though, is not specifically what these planetary boundaries are, or if they're measured correctly, or even if they're real, but that we are stressing the planet, and there are some indications that we're exceeding the ability of planet Earth to cope with the rate and degree of change that we're placing upon it now. So again, the grand challenge for us, or for humanity at least, is to maintain agricultural productivity, since we all rely on food, while managing trade-offs. Trade-offs between um, food production and quality of life, food production and other uses for water, food production and wildlife habitat, food production and ecosystem services, etc., etc. It's worth noting that we're not the first civilization to have these kind of threats. Advanced agricultural civilizations throughout history have collapsed. One example of that is the Indus Valley in India, which collapsed after monsoon cycles, so rain cycles, changed over a period of 2 centuries. And the end result of that was a complete collapse of this civilization. Another example, one they probably know of from history books, and I do simplify these, of course, is that of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization in many ways. And this was, again, an agriculturally based civilization that collapsed because soil productivity collapsed through over irrigation, or rather irrigation that led to salinization of the land and prevented cropping. Another example that's ongoing and current is Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. Here, removing trees actually led to an increase in the water table. Water table has waterlogged productive cropland, and this leading to the rapid loss of cropland, and this unexpected result of simply clearing trees to produce cropland. And that's an ongoing collapse. That's Australia, since that's their breadbasket, is spending a lot of time and effort to try to stop or reverse. Of course, these kind of collapses have hit very close to home, because we all know, living in the Great Plains, about the Dust Bowl, the sort of collapse of agriculture in western Kansas and Oklahoma and parts of Nebraska, driven really by over cultivation of the land, and then proximately driven by severe drought that caused the land to start moving, if you will, in blowing. So these kind of agricultural collapses, if you will, can occur at multiple scales, or any scale, from your field, which can be ruined by salinization, for example, to, say, the sandhills, 20,000 square miles, which could have its productivity ruined by invasion by eastern red cedar, a process that we see happening now. And an example of the picture on the right is actually a fire we started with drones in the sandhills to try to remove cedars from the sandhills. So one thing we've learned is that sort of collapse, ecological or social ecological collapse, as we sort of resilience nerds call it, leads to a completely different system than when you started. In agricultural systems, you're going from productive, think Western Kansas, 1920, to western Kansas, 1935, going from productive to a very barren landscape. Or think of rangelands that can go from grassland, but given a series of events, and I'll talk about that in Nebraska a bit more, can flip to shrublands, which obviously lacking grass are much less productive for agriculture, animal agriculture. And we see these kind of dynamics happening in Nebraska, where the example of the sandhills, we'll sort of talk about a bit, we see much of Nebraska changing from grassland, a desired state of the system for, I think, most people in Nebraska, to two alternative states, which are quite obvious. One, shifting to moving dunes, and I'm not sure how aware folks are, but the Nebraska sandhills really are dunes that have been frozen by grass. They're mobile as recently as 1,000 or so years ago, actually, dune systems. Now the dunes are mobilized by grass, and so a great fear, and one that's recognized by people, has been that blowouts, a Nebraska phenomena of sand blowouts, may spread across the sandhills, turn it back into a dunes system, and absolutely ruin their productivity. That's what ranchers in Nebraska have been concerned about in the sandhills historically and until recently. While they've focused on blowouts and preventing grassland from becoming a sand dune, a different sort of challenge threat to the sandhills occurred, and that's invasion by trees, as shown on the picture on the right. And the tree invasion is occurring in Nebraska because of the lack of, predominantly because of the lack of fire in the sandhills. Fire was suppressed in the sandhills. It was culturally used by indigenous people and would spread across the sandhills. It was suppressed because fire was thought to be a big risk or driver of emerging sand dunes because fire removes vegetation. And so ranchers put on and do put in a lot of effort to keep grass, the sandhills, very grassy, much grassier than they were historically. And some of those things they've done to keep the sandhills grassy have also helped aid the spread of trees, undesirable trees, and in particular eastern red cedar. Eastern red cedar is the most fire vulnerable tree in North America, and therefore it's quite clear that fire suppression is probably the major driver of tree spread in the sandhills. And again, when the sandhills are full of trees, you're not raising much cows. So to resilience, and what's resilience have to do with this? I mentioned earlier that everybody has an intuitive idea of what resilience is, but resilience means two things. And most people's intuitive knowledge and idea of what resilience means is correct but partial. Usually, what people mean when they say, I'm resilient or a landscape is resilient, they mean that after disturbance, that it recovers quite quickly. And that's what's shown on this graphic. I think my mouse can be seen, but if you think of an output like cattle production in the sandhills, without disturbance over time, cattle production continues. It varies, of course, but it continues. But given a big disturbance, let's say fire on the landscape, that function or production of cattle drops. And what we're concerned with in this definition of resilience is recovering that productivity quite quickly. So in most cases, when a system is disturbed, an agricultural system or a human or any kind of complex system, and humans are complex adaptive systems, recovery happens. However, there's a rare but very consequential time when recovery isn't possible. And that's where ecological resilience comes in. So this has a slightly different definition than what people think generally resilience means, recovery. Ecological resilience is simply a measure of the amount of disturbance a system can take before it collapses and changes into a completely different system. And one way we show that is with this little graphic on the left, where the state of a system is shown as a ball, and it can roll around in the system state, which is simply to say that grassland, varies over time. It can have, species A and B and some forbs, and the makeup can change, can be disturbed, but it stays grassland. But you perturb it enough, you put enough trees in the system, and then the system becomes something very different. In this example, it becomes a forest. And so that's called an alternative state of a system. And the problem with alternative states of a system is it's very hard to change a system from one state to another. So again, resilience means two things. It means the ability to recover, and most disturbances are recoverable from. So most of the time, that definition of resilience is fine. How fast can we recover? And it's important to recover. But every once in a while, rarely, and much more consequentially, there's a disturbance that's so extensive or the system so weakened that the system can't recover and become something very different. So examples of that are sandhills, given enough disturbance, as I've stated before, can become moving grasslands. And this is undesirable, of course, for humans. Sandhills becoming, again, given enough disturbance, in this case, say the lack of a disturbance, fire, can become woodlands. And both these pictures are from sandhills of Nebraska. One is much more desirable for humans, at least for agricultural production. So when a system changes, and excuse the blurriness of this picture, when a system changes, it usually provides much fewer of the desired and expected goods and services. So one of those goods and services from agricultural landscapes, say rangeland, is the production of cattle. When you flip to a tree dominated system, your cattle production drops 70% or more. There's another reason why we're concerned about these rare but consequential changes of systems. And let me refocus you just a minute for the Platte River. Platte River is really important to agriculture in Nebraska. It's also important to migrating cranes and other things. And historically, the Platte River looked sort of like the picture in the upper left, which is it was a braided river with sandbars. It moved all the time. The sandbars were what provided roosting habitat for sandhill cranes. And what kept this river a sandy, non-vegetated system like this was periodic spring floods that would just flatten the vegetation, just push it downstream. Humans, of course, are interested in reducing natural variability. So we build dams, so the hydrograph of rivers is flattened. What that's happened in the Platte is meant that the Platte River has changed to a condition like we see in the middle. It has changed states from a free-flowing, moving, dynamic sandbar river to one with islands that are cemented in place and immobile, more or less, cemented by trees. So hysteresis is a fancy word to say the path in is different from the path out. In the case of the Platte River, it became different, fundamentally different, simply by stopping floods going downstream. So you would think you could simply put floods back in the river and we'd get the original system river state back. But that's not the case because the sandbars and the banks of the river are hardened by invasive vegetation. And the lower right picture is an example of Phragmites lining the river now. And right past the Phragmites zone is a zone of cottonwood and other trees. So you could put a flood down this river, and it's been done experimentally. Um, and it does very little because you'd have to kill that Phragmites with herbicide, and then you'd have to wait years and plow the islands to get rid of the root structure. You'd have to cut down all the cottonwoods and get that biomass out there. And then after all that effort, you get the sort of original state of the Platte River back. It's difficult to do. The same exists with the Sandhills rangelands. Once it becomes a forest, it's very difficult to restore because you have this huge seed bank of juniper in there. The grass is lost, humidity is increased. There's a lot of reasons. So it's usually in humanity's interest to maintain systems we desire in a desirable state. But I should say, resilience, at least in the definitions I'm using, resilience is not a good or a bad thing. People often say being resilient is good, but the system that you're interested in is in an undesirable state, like a Platte River that's all trees or the Sandhills that's all treed, then it's highly resilient, but in an undesirable state. So resilience is not a normative concept. It's just a measure of how much disturbance the system can take, whether that system is desirable or not. Especially in agriculture, when we manage for resilience, we seek to guarantee productivity over a wide range of conditions versus how often we manage natural resources or agriculture, where we seek to optimize and maximize output under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions, especially in a place like Nebraska with highly variable climate, ideal conditions rarely occur. So resilience is, at least a resilience approach to agriculture, may sacrifice productivity in some years, but it guarantees or is more likely to guarantee productivity across all years. So what can we do for systems that are threatened in any way? Well, we can, if the system's in reasonable state and desirable, we can foster the resilience of that system. In a bit, I have some ideas of how we might foster agricultural resilience. If the system is compromised a bit, like the sandhills being invaded by trees, we can try to return to the original state. The driver can be controlled. And the driver for tree invasion, of course, is the lack of fire, which we can put back in the landscape, and control of trees that are actually producing propagules, seeds, and a mature red cedar produces millions of seeds. So we cut trees and we burn trees and we introduce fire to the ground. And so we can foster a return to the pure grassland, and then we can maintain the resilience of that system. But there's another idea when the system is undesirable, say a forested sand hills, and this problem is not unique to Nebraska. Most of the southern Great Plains has already been lost to tree invasions. And in that case, it's possible to try to transform a system. And transformation in this case means something very specific. It means purposely reducing the resilience of the undesirable system and then helping foster the collapse of that system and reorganization so that a more desirable system emerged. And in fact, the Dust Bowl, as an example, it was an example of transformation. The USDA did some very unique things to restore that landscape. And if you drive through western Kansas now, you'll see little sign of Dust Bowl, and you'll see a highly productive agricultural system. And that was a purposeful effort and a very expensive effort to transform the system. So again, it's much more viable to maintain a desirable system and maintain its resilience than to transform an undesirable system because it's difficult, it's expensive, and the outcome is far from assured. We can't control that reorganization very well. So to transform a system, it's simply reducing the resilience of that system or looking for a window of opportunity like the right disturbance and taking advantage of that and trying to foster the emergence of a more desired system. I won't talk about this at all. I'm simply that it is possible, if one were interested, to measure and assess and quantify resilience, but we won't do that now. So what can we do in agricultural systems? What have we learned as ways to um, enhance the resilience of um, agricultural systems that may have weakened or lessened resilience? Well, first, we can restore marginal lands, and this is a big typo that I thought I corrected. Restore marginal lands to natural states. For example, the corners of pivots or plowing through wetlands, which may produce some income some years, but rarely, by doing so, really has ecological costs. Working with the land and allowing ecosystem services that do get exported into adjacent agricultural lands on those marginal properties. In fact, CRP attempts to do that, restore marginal land from production and put it into grassland or other natural cover and take advantage of natural ecosystem services on those lands that produce little in the first case. Often in agriculture, and almost all my colleagues, they work on, when we talk about agriculture, they're talking about increasing the output of a single crop on a single farm. And it's important to think broader than farms and think about landscapes. I started off about talking about how our agriculture is embedded in a rapidly changing planet. Well, our farms are embedded in landscapes, and those landscapes matter because a lot of the disturbances that affect farming or affect natural ecosystems for that matter are what we call spatially contagious, which means they spread in space. Think of tree invasion. They don't just pop up all over the sandhills. Trees are invading from the south and from the east in the sandhills. And that's because that's where the seed sources are, and it slowly spreads. Pests, it's pest spread. Another agricultural collapse that's happening right now is citrus greening in Florida is leading to the complete collapse of agriculture or orange production in Florida. I think we've dropped 90% in the last 5 years. And this is a sort of combined canker and a disease that work together. And these spread in space too. So a lot of these things are spatially contagious, the things that threaten farms. And so the context, the landscape is very important. And there's ways we can manage landscapes, managing connectivity to sort of reduce the impacts of negative spreading threats. Account for and value ecosystem services or nature's benefits, as it's come to be called more recently. So there's services like pest control that are important in the landscape, and accounting for those are important, and valuing them in some way is important. Similarly, as part of managing landscapes, use the buffering capacity that's possible with non-land crop land covers that can serve as sinks for pests and sources for predators and things like that. Diversify. One lesson from ecology is that Monocultures are highly vulnerable. Um, Diversity, one truism we can get out of resilience research is that generally or almost always diversity is a good thing in terms of enhancing resilience. And that includes in cropland. In 1958, I believe the average farm in Nebraska produced 16 different crops or animals. Today it's two, and that'd be corn and soybeans for the most part. That makes our agriculture vulnerable. Use precision techniques in terms of where and when agriculture is watered or where pesticides and herbicides are applied to reduce runoff. Again, getting back to the idea that we're all globally connected. I'm sure folks are familiar, but what we do in terms of fertilizer use in Nebraska and Iowa and the upper Midwest is affecting the Gulf of Mexico and creating a hypoxic, an area with no oxygen in the water, hypoxic zone off on the coast of Louisiana. And this affects farmers, if you will, shrimp farmers in the Gulf of Mexico, and is bad for them. So using precision techniques saves people money, less input, and also reduces runoff and downstream or telecoupled effects. Identify win-win propositions. I would propose that one of those would be things like removing pivot corners or small wetlands from production and letting those go back to natural cover and produce ecosystem services that are beneficial and also provide habitat and habitat for wildlife and plants. Provide economic benefit to farmers and others who actually manage their land in a way that provides ecosystem services. It's hard to argue to farmers or ranchers that they should maintain, say, natural land cover when it provides no economic benefit to them. And so there's lots of schemes, at least being planned, and I don't think any universally accepted or well accepted now, to provide people economic benefit for the ecosystem services that come off their land. It's one possibility. Reduce food waste may sound sort of obvious and something people have always talked about, but it's a big deal. We do produce a lot of food in the world that is not actually utilized by people. Similar to precision management, improving water and nutrient management, precision techniques are one of those ways, but improving those to reduce water waste, reduce impacts on water, so improve water quality, reduce nutrient inputs that have impacts in the Gulf of Mexico, but also have impacts on nitrate levels in our city water supplies. And it's a very, very expensive proposition. Places like Grand Island have discovered to have to find new water supplies if your groundwater is polluted with nitrates. Alter demand and develop alternative crops. This is part of diversifying. This is just provides resilience. If one crop is damaged in a drought, if you have more drought resistant crops that can still produce during bad times, it's a benefit, a resilient benefit. And finally, I would simply say that agricultural landscapes are our future because we all need to eat, and food security is paramount for humanity. And maintaining resilient agricultural landscapes is important to us all because much of the United States and much of the world is devoted to agriculture, and how we treat that land and how we raise agriculture, even if we're not farmers, matters. It matters for a lot of reasons. I'm sure that is, I'm at the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
We do have a few questions in the chat. Rita's asking what programs offering financial incentives are available to farmers interested in incorporating ecological principles but are daunted by the cost of adopting new practices.
Ah, man, and I'm not great for all the specifics, but I do know there's a number, and I mentioned one, which is CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, which will incentivize taking marginal lands out of production and actually pay you to have those marginal lands kept out of production and put in natural land covers. There's also programs that are similar for the restoration of wetlands, and often folks are farming through wetlands simply because it's always been done, and often these lands are pretty marginal. And so federal programs um, provide dollars for those kind of things and more. The fate of those federal programs in the immediate future, I'm unsure of, but I do know that the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission is more than happy to work with uh, landowners and point them to the way to the proper programs or a number of different programs run by feds, run by the state, and run by private entities like Pheasants Forever. So if you were to contact the private lands lead for Nebraska Game and Park, who is stationed down at the Nebraska Game and Parks office building in Lincoln, Nebraska, they would be more than happy to talk very much specifics.
John says, please put up slide 2 or 3, show the pressure of different issues on the earth. Why isn't fresh water usage more of an issue?
Yeah, and that instead of, well, I can pop that up, I guess. I just have a share again. I believe you're talking about this slide. And I would make one strong point, which is that this particular plot slide of planetary boundaries is outdated. And I think it's correct to say, I certainly know the UN was predicting just a few years ago that water would be the primary source of global conflict in the near future, compared to other things like oil as a driver in the recent past. One issue with fresh water is that the scarcity or abundance is certainly not uniformly spread across the planet. I talked a bit about Nebraska versus Texas, say, with the Great Plains aquifer. We have an abundance of water, and northern Texas does not. I would have to look, and there's this particular iteration of the planetary boundaries. This slide is a bit old, and there's a new version that shows actually 6 of the planetary boundaries being surpassed. And I'd have to check, or you could look to see if freshwater use is far increased and what their reasoning was for not having fresh water as one of those planetary boundaries that's close to being surpassed. I agree. In
Vern
that
asked,
particular slide, I found that a little odd as well, given that water is a huge issue going forward.
can farmers convert to hemp?
I mean, University of Nebraska has at least Joe Luck name and others who are looking at hemp production in Nebraska, and it has a lot of promise in a lot of ways, in that it's much stingier in its water use. It has a lot of uses industrially as well as otherwise. and the seeds of lots of oils. So there is research ongoing in Nebraska, and there is, of course, a considerable hemp production going on now in the United States. I'm not quite sure how much there is in Nebraska, but it's an area again of active research and a crop that was neglected, obviously, because of the illegality of marijuana. But hemp was a traditional crop in the United States and is definitely increasing. And Nebraska would be, I mean, if you've walked in any prairie in Nebraska, you see that hemp is a big, not necessarily big, sometimes a big part of the herbaceous cover. And I think folks believe, and I believe, that hemp would grow very, very well in Nebraska. Will hemp grow in sandy soil? I don't know. I don't think it's very well adapted to places like the sand hills where if you're not sub-irrigated, you know, a few days and you're basically rain or drought because sand doesn't hold water at all. And I don't while hemp is far less water intensive than corn and soybean. I don't think it's suited for sandhills kind of sandiness. I have a question of what was grown in 1968, and I think so. Yeah, in the earlier 1950s and the 1960s, 16 crops. This would be diverse cropping, and you know, that would vary by farm, but most farms would have a couple different animals, chickens, certainly, cows, maybe goats, and multiple um, food crops being grown. I can't answer the specifics in that case, but Nebraska does grow a whole lot more agricultural product than just corn and soybean, and it ranges from sugar beets, of course, to pumpkins, to other at much smaller scales, more traditional food crops, since corn and soybean are really raised less for people food than others. Yes, and that's um, excellent. Yeah, alfalfa, oats, rye, those kind of crops as well.
We do have another question in the Q&A. In your metaphor with the ball, would you say that some holes are deeper than others? How would you deepen the hole of a certain ecosystem and foster that resilience?
Yeah, so indeed, the depth of that hole, if you will, is usually meant to signify the resilience of the system because it's harder to push it up a steep slope, the state of the system. And that depth is enhanced by strong positive feedbacks. For example, maintaining the grass and fire association. This is a very strong feedback that maintains grasslands as grassland when that feedback is allowed. Obviously, there's reasons we can't let fire just um, spread across the sandhills nilly-willy, if you will. But maintaining very strong feedbacks like that is very important to resilience, or doing other things like enhancing diversity, which allows incorporation and response to a broader range of disturbances, if you will. All those kinds of things uh, deepen the depth of the cup, if you will, to use it entirely metaphorically.
John says a Morse Bluff, Nebraska lumberjack is specializing in harvesting large western red cedar.
Hmm. Yeah, you know, and the U.S., not U.S., the Nebraska, well, with the U.S. Forest Service, but especially the Nebraska Forest Service has had and continues to have an emphasis because, we do have cedar forests now in developing markets for cedar. It is a relatively low value tree and sort of costs of moving it can be high and the markets are far, which is problematic. But places like Curtis, for example, um, use cedar for heating. And there's also been attempts made to use get biomass ethanol from cedar. I don't think very successfully. But there are products and potentially developing markets for cedar. The challenge, of course, is compared to rangeland and sort of the grasslands we value, cedar is a much less of a valued economic product. Pretty
Vern,
specialty crop. Yep.
Vern has a few questions. Is the Ogallala aquifer being drained dry by row crop farmers? Will it recover if it is drained dry?
Controversial question, perhaps where you ask it. In Nebraska, the aquifer is actually because of irrigation raised in some areas. The who produces this? I think it's the Nebraska Water Center produces a groundwater map each year that's available on the internet that can show this. And there's areas where there's some areas of decline and a surprising number of areas of increase because of irrigation. So in Nebraska, the threat, if you will, the challenge with agriculture, if you will, irrigated agriculture in Nebraska is less taking water from the aquifer and more utilization of surface waters. For example, the Platte goes dry more than it used to. It's always been highly variable. If you go farther south in the aquifer, the water is being mined, and it's being mined largely for agriculture. So the water table is the the depth of the aquifer, the deepness of it is very, very shallow in Nebraska and deep Texas in the Panhandle, and getting such in some places irrigation's having to be abandoned. Not an issue in Nebraska, not one I would see in the foreseeable future, not caused by agriculture. I think there's a lot of cities outside of the Great Plains that see that big pocket of water in an aquifer under Nebraska and look at it with quite jealousy. So it's a very important resource for Nebraska. I think, and as far as recovery, it depends. The Sandhills is having those sandy soils, which would make hemp difficult to grow, is very good for aquifer recharge. The water runs right through it into the aquifer. In other areas of the aquifer, like in again, North Texas, you're on very much clay soils and you are not recharging the aquifer down there. And again, it's being mined. So very, very different situations depending where you're on the aquifer. And the Ogallala aquifer, we used to use that term to refer to the entire aquifer, but it's really a bunch of sub aquifers where the Ogallala is one, and there's other disconnected aquifers that we all sort of put under the moniker of Great Plains aquifer, and some are more challenged than others. Again, I think Nebraska is in um, for the Great Plains in amazing shape with the water resources we have in terms of groundwater, a little more challenged in terms of surface waters. And let me just take the opportunity to state, and I stated this to Laura and Morgan before the beginning of this meeting, I was looking at the New York Times today and I was surprised to see Nebraska featured in a story about the rivers of the Sandhills. And it's a very nice article, surprising to see the national press of the Sandhills spring-fed rivers being featured as such amazing places.
There's another question in the Q&A. Are regenerative agriculture systems with enhanced soil health and economic and environmental future here in Nebraska?
Are they, let me, I can, you know, I've done research a bit on regenerative ranching and some of these things, and one thing we found is that there's this idea is fairly nascent, it's fairly trendy, and it means a whole lot of different things to different people. A lot of the times, the focus of regenerative practices is on the soil. And certainly any soil conserving and enhancing um, activities that can do are good. And a lot of those are being put in place in Nebraska, yes. Um, but I don't know that there's a concerted suite of things that are really accepted to be regenerative agriculture at this time, other than being a term that really covers a whole lot of practices that are meant to sort of conserve and improve and restore properties of agricultural systems, where the focus actually ends up being in practice mostly on soils. And of course, soil is critical and paramount to agriculture. I think there are a lot of things that could be done in Nebraska that are done in other states in terms of soil conservation, such as grassing, um, field drainages. Where I lived in Nebraska, my neighbor was a farmer, and he would get enormous gullies every year. And you can only imagine the tons of soil flowing off his property. They'd simply plow through the gully the next year and do the same thing over and over, where it could be grassed and save that soil. So I'd say yes, no, regenerative agriculture, a suite of really mostly really good ideas that are being enacted more more sporadically or here and there across the state, but being pushed by extension, pushed, that is, being sold as it should be to folks by extension and others.
I'm not seeing any other questions. So thank you everyone very much for attending. Thank you, Craig, for presenting, and have a good evening, everyone.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you, folks.